You're listening to a production of the National Media Archive. To learn more or volunteer, go to nationalmediaarchive.com.
The official story goes something like this. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue and allegedly brought back syphilis from the New World, a gift from the Native Americans to Europe in return for smallpox and destruction. It's a neat historical irony, but it might be completely wrong. Turns out a dig in Hull, England, yes, that Hull, might flip the whole narrative. City planners were building a new magistrates' court next to a car park. Classic British town center stuff. But before laying down concrete, the local archaeology unit got permission to poke around. Time was tight, so the crew worked around the clock. What they found? Over 240 skeletons, plus artifacts, the kind of medieval leftovers that paint a very messy picture of how religion, medicine, money, and sex were all entangled. One find stood out. A complete ground plan of a medieval friary, almost perfectly preserved. That's rare. Leading the dig was archaeologist John Buglas, who explained how remarkable the preservation was. Not just bones, but coffins, shoes still on feet, leather goods, and even textiles. This wasn't just bones and dirt. This was a medieval time capsule. One skeleton, labeled 1216, changed everything. Skeleton 1216 belonged to a man aged somewhere between 25 and 35. Early examination showed lesions on the skull and signs of an infectious disease. Experts suspected syphilis. And not just suspected, they were confident. The bones were shipped off to the University of Bradford, where paleopathologist Charlotte Roberts, an expert in ancient disease, took a closer look. The skull had pockmarks, proper holes in the bone, known as caries sicca, a textbook sign of venereal syphilis. There was also a hole in the palate connecting the nose and mouth, another smoking gun. And moving down the body, the signs stacked up. The femur, the thigh bone, was deformed by bone growth. The tibia, lower leg, had so much swelling it resembled what's called a saber shin, where the bone bulges like a blade. Syphilis leaves a signature on the skeleton in its third stage, and 1216 had it all. The real twist? This man wasn't alone. 2 more skeletons from the Hull site had full-blown signs of syphilis. More than half showed at least some evidence of infection. Here's the kicker. These people weren't buried in a random pit outside city walls. They were interred in the heart of a monastery, inside the sacred walls of a religious community. A friary, to be exact, home to the Augustinian friars. Now, the Augustinians weren't wealthy. They were supposed to beg for a living, care for the poor, provide medical help, and live celibate lives. So how do we explain 3 textbook cases of a sexually transmitted disease in their midst? More evidence added fuel to the fire. 12 skeletons had wooden rods buried beside them. Not random sticks, but smooth, bark-covered hazel rods, around the length used for self-flagellation. The implication? These friars may have belonged to a sect that practiced self-punishment to cleanse their sins. Think plague-era spiritual panic. Hair shirts, whip scars, pain equals salvation. That didn't stop them from profiting off death. These friars sold winding sheets, candles, and burial services to wealthy families trying to buy their way into heaven. The deeper the wallet, the closer the body got to the altar. One will from Hull even stipulated payment per friar attending a funeral mass, which, let's be honest, is a system just begging to be gamed. Far from isolated, this friary was plopped right into Hull's commercial district, surrounded by merchant homes and portside taverns. Hull was a busy wine importing town, bringing in 1.5 million liters annually, a massive amount in medieval terms. Drinking and carousing were part of the scene. Wine jugs were found at the site in bulk. So while it's not proof of debauchery, the vibes were less pure piety, more medieval mixer. That brings us back to skeleton 1216. His bones were buried in a VIP location, right near the altar, which means he was either a senior friar or a wealthy donor. Either way, he was no outsider. So when did he die? Because this is the part that breaks history. If he died before 1492, then Columbus didn't bring syphilis to Europe. It was already here. Archaeologists needed a hard date. Lucky for them, the site's waterlogged soil preserved wooden coffins, a rare bonus. Enter dendrochronology, the science of dating tree rings. Over 300 samples were taken and matched against national databases. The result? The coffins were made from trees felled between 1340 and 1369. That places the burials smack in the middle of the 14th century. That's over 100 years before Columbus sailed west. The implications? Massive. Because the standard history books pin the origin of syphilis to Columbus's first voyage to the Americas in 1492, returning in 1493 with crew members supposedly infected via sexual contact with indigenous people. But skeleton Tuanslan 16 was in the ground long before any of that happened. But to rewrite 500 years of accepted history, more than bone lesions and tree rings were needed. For true academic firepower, archaeologists needed radiocarbon dating, a method that measures how much radioactive carbon remains in bones to estimate time of death. It's the gold standard. Samples from skeleton 1216 were sent to the Oxford Radiocarbon Accelerator Unit. And after testing, the results were clear. The man died sometime between 1300 and 1420. That's at least 70 years before Columbus even thought about heading west. Case closed? Not quite. At an international conference in Texas, Charlotte Roberts presented her findings to George Armelagos, a big name in the field and longtime champion of the Columbus theory. Also in the room, Don Ortner, curator at the Smithsonian. Charlotte laid out the evidence, the bone lesions, the carbon date, the 60% infection rate at the site. George examined the skull photos. His response? Classic syphilis. He admitted it, but he wasn't ready to fully abandon Columbus just yet, because here's the sticking point. One skeleton, no matter how compelling, doesn't make a pandemic. George's argument was simple. He'd seen tons of cases from the New World, all predating 1492, across broad regions, affecting whole populations. The Old World, meanwhile, had almost nothing, until now. So why hadn't syphilis shown up in medieval European skeletons before? Charlotte had an answer. Syphilis takes decades to leave marks on bone. Most people in the 14th century didn't live long enough to reach that third stage. Black Death, cholera, smallpox. Medieval life was a horror show. People died young. If syphilis killed them early, it wouldn't leave a trace. That's what makes 1216 so rare. He lived long enough for the disease to ravage his bones. But still, one example wasn't enough to convince skeptics. What George and others wanted was a carbon-dated child skeleton with congenital syphilis, a form passed from mother to baby during pregnancy. That's the slam-dunk proof of sexually transmitted syphilis in a population. And up to that point, those cases had only been found in the Americas. The debate dragged on until another bombshell hit, this time from southern Italy, at an ancient Greek settlement called Metaponto. Archaeologists Mathieu and Renata Henneberg were analyzing remains from a 2,600-year-old port town. They found skeletons riddled with the same bone deformities seen in Hull. Then Renata, a dental expert, found the critical piece, a child's teeth with deep grooves, classic signs of congenital syphilis. That changed the game. If syphilis was in Italy 6 centuries before Jesus, Columbus had nothing to do with it. And the Hennebergs didn't stop there. They searched other ancient sites, including Pompeii. Beyond bones, they looked at Roman texts, medical writings, and even urban planning. They found evidence of a highly sexualized port culture with a booming sex trade. Perfect conditions for venereal syphilis to spread. Their theory? Syphilis had always been here, in Europe. But depending on the climate and society, it mutated. In pre-Columbian America, syphilis looked different. Mary Lucas Powell studied how the disease spread through indigenous communities in the southeastern U.S. Her findings? It was a skin disease, not sexually transmitted. Passed through casual contact, shared bowls, communal sleeping. Everyone got it as a kid. But it was mild. And because they got it early, they developed immunity to the severe form. But when Europeans showed up, they brought diseases that decimated the native population. That collapse wiped out the protective cycle. And when the aggressive, sexually transmitted strain came back with colonizers, the effect was catastrophic. So now, the big question isn't who gave syphilis to whom, it's how and why the disease changed. Syphilis is a shapeshifter. In isolated, hot, rural environments like pre-Columbian America, it survived as a mild, non-sexual childhood infection. But in cities, cold, clothed, and hygienic, that version couldn't spread. So the bacteria mutated into something more sinister. A sexually transmitted killer. Hull, Metaponto, Pompeii, Naples. They weren't just cities. They were ports. Busy, filthy, international crossroads with alcohol, sex, and diseases from everywhere. That's where syphilis turned deadly. Because it had to. Ports aren't just where cargo changes hands. They're where bacteria get passports. And syphilis? It's the ultimate global hitchhiker. Hull in the 14th century wasn't just trading wool and wine. The archaeological site had evidence of international contact on a ridiculous scale. Wine jugs from Spain, coffin wood from the Baltic, trace metals on friary stones from as far away as the Far East. This was a microcosm of global commerce, and a petri dish for disease evolution. In places like this, people didn't just exchange goods. They exchanged fluids. Foreign sailors, local sex workers, friars who were supposed to be celibate but clearly weren't. The environment was primed for mutation. The older, milder skin contact version of the bacteria couldn't thrive. Too many clothes, too much hygiene, too little contact. The result? A transformation into a more efficient mode of transmission. Sex. Epidemiologically, it makes sense. Diseases adapt to the environment, strip away the casual contact opportunities, and the bacteria had to find new routes. And in bustling medieval port cities, venereal transmission was the route that worked. That's why medieval syphilis exploded, not in isolated rural hamlets, but in dense cosmopolitan trade hubs, the same kinds of places that were importing everything from spices to scandal. That's where skeleton 1216 comes in. A man buried in the elite zone of a friary, in the middle of a boomtown, riddled with syphilis lesions. Not an outlier, a representative. Still, some researchers kept clinging to the Columbus origin story. George Armelagos had spent decades building that case, and to be fair, his findings weren't wrong, just incomplete. He'd found evidence of syphilis-like lesions across the pre-Columbian Americas. But remember, those were mostly the non-venereal type, mild, childhood-acquired, non-sexual. That strain wouldn't show up in Europe because it couldn't survive here. Meanwhile, back in the Old World, the deeper researchers dug, the more ancient syphilis began to surface. The Henneberg's skeletons from Metaponto dated back to the 6th century BC. Their dental evidence? Slam dunk for congenital syphilis. Add that to Pompeii, where records showed a thriving sex industry and physical signs of the disease, and suddenly the Columbus theory started to wobble hard. But this wasn't just about bones and bacteria. It was about narrative. The Columbus brought it back theory was tidy. It had villains, victims, and historical justice. Europeans devastated the New World with smallpox. Native Americans gave back syphilis. It felt karmic. But science doesn't care about neat stories. The evidence was now saying something else. The bacteria that causes syphilis, Treponema pallidum, has been around a long time, and it's been adapting, evolving, and mutating as long as humans have been interacting. The version that showed up in Renaissance Europe like a biblical plague wasn't imported from across the Atlantic. It was homegrown. It was a mutation, a very local, very deadly remix of an old disease forced to find a new route in changing urban conditions. And what happened next? Nothing short of mass hysteria. By the end of the 15th century, syphilis was sweeping through Europe like wildfire. The first unchallenged written account came from Joseph Grunpeck, a German scholar describing the scene at the Siege of Naples in 1495. Spanish soldiers were afflicted with lesions, boils, and what he called the rotting of the male organ. It was grotesque. Men were dying in agony, their bodies covered in ulcers, their bones literally crumbling. Nobody knew what caused it. Everybody blamed someone else. The Germans called it the French disease. The French called it the Neapolitan disease. The Italians blamed the Spanish. The Spanish blamed Columbus's crew, and Columbus's doctor blamed Indigenous American women. Blame shifted faster than the disease spread. But as the archaeological record now shows, the timing doesn't line up. Syphilis was already here, in England, in Italy, in port towns like Hull and Pompeii, long before Columbus returned to Europe. Which means the real story is weirder, older, and way more human than the textbook version. What history books skipped is this. Diseases don't follow ships, they follow people. And people don't just stay put. Ancient Rome, medieval Hull, Greek ports, Spanish wine traders, all were part of a tangled network where infections traveled with ease, long before anyone set foot on a Caribbean beach. But if syphilis was already in Europe, why did it suddenly explode into an epidemic right after 1492? That's where things get complicated. See, it's not just about presence, it's about context. For most of its history, syphilis stayed in the background. a quiet skin infection in rural areas. Not especially deadly, not especially shameful, but put it in the middle of a growing European city with denser populations, better clothing, tighter hygiene, and more concentrated sexual networks, and everything changes. The bacteria had to level up to survive. In scientific terms, Treponema pallidum mutated into its most aggressive form. In practical terms, it became a monster. The post-1492 version of syphilis wasn't slow and subtle. It hit hard and fast. Soldiers at the siege of Naples watched their skin erupt in ulcers. Their bones deteriorated, their genitals rotted. It was painful, visible, and stigmatized. It wasn't just a disease. It was a judgment. In a religiously obsessed Europe, syphilis became the new leprosy, except worse because it was tied to sex. The fear was biblical. The shame, eternal. Whole cities were gripped with paranoia. Hospitals were built just to isolate syphilis patients. Prostitutes were rounded up, examined, quarantined, or worse. People genuinely believed this was divine punishment for sexual sin. But again, the science doesn't back the sudden emergence. It backs a slow burn, mutated over centuries, pushed into its terrifying new form by evolving urban conditions. Columbus might have helped spread the disease, sure, but he didn't invent it. Europe didn't import syphilis. It incubated it. And then, centuries later, exported the deadliest version right back to the Americas. Here's the ultimate plot twist. When Europeans showed up with their plagues and parasites, they also shattered Native American population structures. Entire villages wiped out by smallpox, measles, influenza, diseases they had zero immunity against. But there was collateral damage even from the diseases they had adapted to. In indigenous cultures, that mild skin version of syphilis was so common in kids that it acted like a natural vaccine. Most people got it early, developed immunity, and avoided the nastier forms for life. But after European contact, that system collapsed. Fewer kids survived. The transmission cycle broke, and by the time venereal syphilis arrived, there was no protection left. It wasn't just a colonial exchange, it was a full reset. The irony? The very thing Native Americans were accused of giving to Europe, syphilis, may have come from Europe in its most vicious form, after being warped by the very civilization that blamed them. There's one more reason researchers now know this disease goes back further than Columbus. Ancient child skeletons. Remember, the gold standard for proving congenital syphilis is tooth deformation. Grooves in the enamel that happen when a fetus is infected during pregnancy. For decades, those grooves were found only in American sites. Then came Hull, and Metaponto, and Pompeii. The Henneberg's work in Italy wasn't just about finding adult bones with lesions. They found children with syphilitic teeth, proof that venereal syphilis had reached multiple generations. And it wasn't some exotic New World mutation. It was part of life in ancient ports, in ancient Europe. But it took looking at the full context, the bones, the writings, the trade, the sex work, the urban density, to connect the dots. The disease didn't explode because it arrived. It exploded because the conditions were finally perfect. And in a brutal twist, those same conditions, ports, trade, crowding, cosmopolitan mixing, were exactly what allowed Europeans to carry the mutated plague back across the Atlantic. Syphilis, it turns out, was always here. But when the world got smaller, it got meaner. So where does that leave the Columbus brought syphilis from America theory? Hanging by a thread. Because here's what it really comes down to. Timing, evidence, and misinterpretation. The Columbus theory survived so long not because the science was airtight, but because the story was convenient. A disease shows up in Europe right after contact with the Americas. Easy connection. Easy blame, especially when the symptoms were tied to sin, shame, and the unclean other. But new forensic techniques, radiocarbon dating, dendrochronology, paleopathology, finally gave the old bones a voice, and they told a messier story. A disease that didn't respect national borders, one that evolved with humanity, one that had been simmering in the background for centuries, waiting for its moment to go viral. Skeleton 1216, not just a corpse. He's a data point, a timestamp, a medieval receipt stamped syphilis was already here. And so were the others. From Hull, Metaponto, Pompeii, all saying the same thing in bone language. This wasn't new. The myth lasted because most researchers weren't even looking for evidence in the old world. Why would they? Everyone knew the disease came from America. It was in the textbooks. It was settled. But that blind spot is exactly why no one had noticed the signs earlier. Charlotte Roberts made that clear. She wasn't saying Hull was the only site with pre-Columbian syphilis. She was saying it's the first one that had been properly examined by people who knew what to look for. And when they looked, lesions, saber shins, palatal holes, caries-sicca, they found the whole package. Over and over. Not just in one skeleton, in dozens. That's not a coincidence. That's a pattern. But still, skeptics like George Armalagos held their ground. His point? One site, even one city, isn't enough to overturn half a millennium of consensus. He wanted volume. He wanted more kids with syphilitic teeth. He wanted more carbon dates. Don Ortner, the Smithsonian curator, offered a compromise. If we want irrefutable proof of syphilis in ancient populations, the best bet isn't bones. It's baby teeth. In the final stage of the debate, all eyes turned to dentition. The enamel grooves left by congenital syphilis form during fetal development. They don't happen by accident. They don't happen from scurvy or rickets or famine. They are the dental fingerprint of an infected womb. And once researchers widened the net, more of those grooves started turning up, in places far from the Americas and in time periods far older than Columbus. The Columbus theory was no longer just under threat. It was unraveling. It turns out that the disease wasn't imported to Europe. It was already in the DNA of European port life, fostered by centuries of trade, conflict, and human interaction. Ancient cities didn't just build temples and aqueducts. They built the perfect environment for pathogens to experiment. And syphilis, being nothing if not adaptable, figured out how to survive, first as a skin disease, then in tighter, more clothed, more sanitized societies as a sexually transmitted plague. The same bacteria. Different version, different rules. The final irony? When Columbus and his men returned from the New World, they didn't bring back syphilis. They brought back a target. Because the Native American populations had been immune to the mild childhood version for generations. But the European plagues wiped out so many of their people, that protective cycle broke. And when the mutated venereal version finally arrived, likely carried back across the Atlantic from Europe, it hit those communities as hard as anything the Europeans had suffered in Naples. Syphilis didn't just circle the globe, it evolved with it. And this is where the myth finally collapses. Not with a bang, but with a timeline. The Columbus theory had one job: explain how a terrifying new disease suddenly burst into Europe after 1492. But now, the bones say otherwise. So do the teeth, the coffins, the trade records, the urban layouts, the medical texts. All those disconnected pieces now converge into a single, unignorable truth. Syphilis didn't arrive with Columbus. It was already here. It just mutated into something the world wasn't ready for. The ancient version was subtle, a skin condition spread through close contact, mostly in kids. Think barefoot childhoods, shared bowls, close quarters. Not pleasant, but manageable. And more importantly, it left behind immunity, a natural firewall. But modern life, even 14th century modern, changed the game. Clothes covered skin. Hygiene improved just enough to make casual contact less effective. Communities got denser. Trade brought strangers from all over the known world. Ports became the pressure cookers of civilization and of disease evolution. So the bacteria adapted. It went underground, literally, into the bloodstream, into the genitals, into the unborn. Venereal syphilis didn't just appear. It was forced into existence by the way cities grew and people lived. It was a side effect of civilization, the price of progress. And it's been following humanity ever since. The takeaway? History's been blaming the wrong side for 500 years. The American Indians didn't give Europe syphilis. If anything, Europe gave it to them after mutating it into something worse than it had ever been. And when the native population structure collapsed, so did the immunity that had protected them. The cycle of early childhood infection, lifelong resistance, and stable transmission broke down and flooded the mutated form. Aggressive, venereal, lethal. What started as a manageable skin disease became a moral panic, a badge of shame, a reason to exile, punish, and fear. But all it really took was one skeleton, a few teeth, and some honest science to rewrite the origin story. So now, with the Columbus theory officially buried, along with skeleton 1216, the history of syphilis finally makes sense. It wasn't imported, it mutated, and we were the vector.